ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, Patricia Carvelis here from the new podcast Politics Now. And as the federal election campaign kicks off, I'm joined by the ABC's sharpest political minds, like Annabelle Crabb.
And so you see him dropping these little, I call them kind of little culture war cherry bombs, like, oh, well, I'm not going to have the Aboriginal flag behind me as Prime Minister.
It's called Politics Now, and you can find it on the ABC Listen app.
Hi, it's Sam Hawley here. A huge thanks to everyone who's been in touch so far to suggest election campaign issues for us to delve a bit deeper into. There was such a broad range of ideas.
I'm interested in learning how Albo's tax relief compares to Dutton's fuel thing.
Climate change and the future generational impacts of that.
Australia's gas and natural resource companies generate significant profits, yet contribute comparatively little in tax revenue when compared to similar industries in other countries.
You also raised issues around asylum seekers, gas and energy policy, dental care costs and childcare.
What are the party's plans to get good qualified people into the field and keep them there long term with, better wages and better conditions?
But the issue we got the most comments about was the influence of money in our politics. So that's the topic we've chosen this time. Today, Grattan Institute researcher Kate Griffiths on political donations and what we do and don't know. From Gadigal Land in Sydney, this is ABC News Daily. So, how rich people influence politics and politicians is on the mind of Evelyn from Bendigo in Victoria, who sent us this question.
In the light of Elon Musk and Doge's dismantling of so many government services in the US, I would like the ABC to investigate the ascendancy of private capital from individual oligarchs such as Gina Rinehart, who seek to buy influence over our own political parties and over the outcome of this federal election. Who are these players and what are their affiliations and agendas?
Kate, do we really have oligarchs here?
Look, fortunately, Australia's political system is not like Russia or even like the US. Wealthy individuals do have power here, and they have greater power than the average Australian voter. But typically their power is in the form of greater access or greater potential to access decision makers, and therefore kind of more opportunities to influence policy, but not necessarily kind of policy capture or explicit quid pro quo. So the Australian system has some really important checks and balances that we maybe don't see in a lot of other systems overseas. And of course, that includes, free and fair elections with compulsory voting. That's incredibly important. And we have strong and largely trusted institutions.
And oligarchs were sort of born out of the former Soviet Union, right?
Indeed, yeah. And when we think of that concept, I think we're thinking not just of the wealthy individual, but also of the wealthy individual who runs the state. And we have a lot of checks and balances to kind of make sure that public policy is made in the public interest. The best example we've got of an individual kind of billionaire influencing politics in Australia is probably Clive Palmer at the last two elections we saw in 2019 and 2022 elections. Big spending by an individual, donating amounts we've never seen before in the Australian political system. All those donations were to his own party, so, running for politics himself, but also, influencing the broader debate through advertising.
No Liberal, Labor or National member will ever stand up for Australia. They're all too concerned about themselves. Join the United Australia Party. Stand with me and Craig Kelly. Together we can stand up for Australia.
Authorised by Craig Kelly for the United Australia Party, Brisbane.
So how much was Clive Palmer spending on himself, do we know?
So we know that, in 2019, he broke all the records for donations, donating $84 million to his own party. And then in 2022, he came back again and blew that out of the water with a $117 million donation to his own party. So those are the two biggest donations on record. In 2022, in the lead up to the federal election in 2022, the next largest donor after Clive Palmer was just $3.7 million. So he's really a whole different scale to the rest of the kind of donation system that we can see in the data.
All right, well, let's have a look then at who is donating and which parties are getting the most money. Now, just to point out before we go on, though, this is the data that we have at the moment, which is sort of old, right? For this campaign, we have to wait for that information to actually be delivered to us and wait quite some time.
Absolutely, yeah. So Australians really ought to know who's backing who in this election campaign, like who's funding the different parties and candidates. But the glaring problem with the data on political donations is that we won't get that information until February 2026,
Wow.
long after the polls have closed.
Yeah.
So yeah, Australians are left in the dark about who's donating right now. The latest data we have is for 2023-24 financial year. So we are basically looking at donations that are at least 7 months old when the data comes out, potentially up to 19 months old. And so we can get this kind of historical picture of patterns in the donations and who's been donating in the past, but we can't get that real-time picture at the moment.
Yeah, that is a concern.
So if we look at that 2023-24 financial year, you know, in that year, Australia's political parties collectively raised $166 million, and most of that 166 million was flowing to the major parties.
Yeah.
But of course, that year wasn't an election year either. So election years are much bigger, typically, more than double. And in the lead up to the 2022 federal election, that was about 400 million that parties were raising in that year.
So Labor received something like 68 million of that 166 million, so a lot of it. And who was giving the Labor Party that money?
We can actually see quite a few billionaires. So we saw billionaire Anthony Pratt donated $1 million to Labor through his company Pratt Holdings. And the coalition was also supported by a couple of billionaires, Harry Triguboff through his company Meriton Property Services and Gina Rinehart through Hancock Prospecting, and each of those to the tune of around $500,000 each. So we can see there are some big donations there in a non-election year from those individuals. We do also see a slightly different pattern in election years. We see really large donations to Labor from various unions in election years. Typically, unions make up at least half of the donations that are on the record to Labor. And the coalition, we see their big donors tend to be wealthy individuals and corporates, as well as both major parties having their own kind of investment vehicles, investment arms. And so we see some big donations from those investment vehicles as well.
And the coalition received 70 million of that 166 million. So about the same, I guess, for the two major parties. We assume as well, Kate, that Justin Hems, a big hospitality entrepreneur, donates to the Liberal Party because, of course, sort of landed the opposition leader in a bit of hot water when he left Queensland during the impending cyclone Alfred to attend a fundraiser with him. That caused quite a bit of controversy, didn't it?
Indeed. And actually, so there are always some donations that come through fundraising functions, and we can see sort of the total aggregate of donations made to some of those sort of fundraising functions and dinners. What we can't always see is what the individual donations made were, which is really frustrating because we know that a function has taken place that raised quite substantial money and that money has been donated to the political party. What we can't see is who was attending that. If we knew who was attending, that would give much better sort of transparency around who has access, who has the potential to influence. Because, you know, we don't want a political system where people actually can't engage with politicians and can't put their views. We need a political system that is open to that, but we also need the transparency around who has access and influence if it's a privileged opportunity, so that we can provide that broader public check. I say we, I mean the public, I mean journalists, I mean the parliament can provide that broader public check on, you know, who's asking what of the government or the opposition, and then, you know, how does their policy platform stack up, and is it starting to look a lot like they're listening to perhaps just a few big interests and not actually to the broader public interest.
We know that Justin Hems donated $300,000 to the Liberal Party at the last election, but as you say, we don't get the figures for this election until next year, which is a rather long wait. Now, what about the Teal movement? That was actually founded, of course, by Simon Holmes à Court, another very rich Australian. That's really changed the political landscape in Australia, hasn't it?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting movement, and in terms of the dollars, we'll put it in a little bit of context. At the 2022 federal election, they collectively spent about $21 million. But $21 million in the scheme of what was spent at the 2022 election, we're talking like 5% of party expenditure.
All right, well, Kate, let's look then at whether there's any proof that these big donations lead to policy changes that can then benefit the donors. Another listener of the podcast, Isabel, she told us that she doesn't think the major parties are doing what the electorate wants. They're actually doing what the lobbyists and the corporate donors want. But is there any way to quantify what donors get in return, if anything? Are there any examples?
Our research shows that, money can buy access. That's not necessarily influence, but it is most definitely an opportunity to influence. We can also see in some of the state data, which provides more information than the federal data, that major donors to state governments are very likely to get a meeting with a senior minister within a few months of the donation. So there's, money is opening doors here. But of course, we need our politicians to be seeking out a wider range of views than just those with a particular vested interest. What we don't have is enough of the checks around what sort of influence might be playing out, because we have, to some degree, some reasonable information on who's donating. We need much better information on the lobbying to understand what the donations are buying and whether that is showing up in policy in a problematic way.
Okay, so again, a transparency issue. In February, of course, the major parties struck a deal to pass changes to electoral funding laws, so they put a cap on donations and campaign expenditure. How significant was that? Does that help anything?
They were very significant reforms. So instead of donations sort of over $16,900 being on the public record, it'll be now donations over $5,000, so that's a much more reasonable level. Maybe not at this election, but at the next election, we should actually know who is donating to whose campaigns during the election campaign. What we also saw in that bill was these caps on donations and electoral expenditure. So capping electoral expenditure is quite important to reduce the fundraising arms race between the parties. This is like, why do they chase these donations in the first place? They chase them so they can get their message far and wide, and it's a bit of an arms race. It really is, between the parties, to outraise the other in order to be able to spend more to get their message further and wider, and ultimately to try and win more votes. So if we can kind of cap that arms race, then the incentive to chase donations is kind of reduced. I would say that the total cap on spending during elections is still too high. The cap is $90 million for a political party, and the per seat cap, so how much you can spend in any individual seat, it's $800,000 in this bill. And I think that that's too low, because it seriously advantages incumbents over new entrants. A new entrant needs to kind of spend more to get their name out there. So essentially, I would love to see the next parliament amend that legislation, not scrap it, but amend it to close some loopholes and level the playing field for new entrants.
And Kate, what do you think? Can our listener, Evelyn, can she be sure that the system is working for her, working for voters ahead of billionaires?
Donations, we couldn't kind of outright ban them, for example, because they're actually protected under the Constitution's implied freedom of political communication. And that's there for a good reason. Political donations can contribute to a healthy democracy. I think you actually need to look at, what are the parties talking about? Why are they putting these policies out there? Do you think that that's going to make Australia a better place to live? And that's very much, an individual voter decision. But I also think, asking the question is important too, because having these sorts of discussions allows us to air where we do think that maybe some industry or some particular wealthy individual is having too much influence, and that is the public check that we need in our democracy to kind of pull back and rebalance in the favour of the many and not the few.
Kate Griffiths is a researcher at the Grattan Institute. Please keep sending us any ideas of election topics you'd like us to unpack, something you've heard in the election campaign, policies you want explained. A quick voice memo, around 30 seconds, would be ideal. Email it to us at abcnewsdaily@abc.net.au. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Adair Shepherd. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.